my people, and welcome to Unit 2, Biology of the Mind, Behavior with our Mind, and welcome to the Brain Unit. So just a little preface, make sure you're taking really good notes. A lot of this lecture videos will be notes. There won't be a lot of activities, or if any at all. I haven't decided yet, but it is a big chapter, so buckle in, and let's get started with our first module, which is all about Nancy the neuron. So before we get into Nancy, we first have to kind of go over the summary of how this big chapter will go. Again, Biology of the Mind is a big chapter, and it's also an anchor to a lot of our other chapters. So again, we're going to go through neural communications. In other video lectures, you'll go through the nervous system, the endocrine system, and then the brain structures. Okay, so this should be the order of the videos, and let's get started with Nancy the neuron. But first, we have to know a few things of how we got there. So the idea of the brain developed over time. First, Plato believed the mind was in the head. Aristotle believed the mind was in our heart. But something to let you guys know, your heart doesn't fall in love, your brain does. So when you say, when you hold your heart, I'm in love, it's really, I'm in love. So remember, your brain is where the emotions lie, right? That's where they interpret them. It's not our heart. Our heart looks a lot uglier in person. So again, back in the 1800s, Franz Gall invented phrenology, which is this theory that the amount of bumps or how big your head is would kind of correlate with your intelligence. They soon realized that that's not always the case, so it was quickly debunked. But again, they started to play around with what is the mind and how can we understand it. And we are going to look through it with the biopsychosocial approach, which we'll talk about during the lecture. All right, so first, here is our celebrity. We have Nancy the neuron. So a neuron is the body's information system, and we're built from billions of interconnected cells. So think of neurons as I'll talk about neural pathways. As you grow and develop, you build more and more neural pathways. So you have a lot of neurons in your body, and they slowly form connections over time. So again, neurons is the basic building block, okay, of our nervous system. Okay, again, neuron. I call our neuron Nancy. So I call her Nancy the neuron, and she or he is essentially the body's information system that supports us. So getting into a little bit more about Nancy, there's three types of Nancy. So there's three types of neurons. We're going to talk about sensory neurons, which carry messages to the brain, okay, from organs and tissues. And then we are going to talk about motor neurons that come from the brain, okay? So sensory neurons go up the spinal cord, and motor neurons come down. So if you think about it this way, it's a one-way highway each way. So going up, sensory motor, coming down is motor neurons, okay? So kind of think of the spine as a freeway, and Nancy loves driving on the freeway. So again, sensory going up. So as I touch my cup, my sensory neurons already went up to my brain, up to the thalamus, which we'll talk about. And then it has already pushed through the fact that I'm holding, right? So motor neurons come down to give orders. And in between, I like to call interneurons like little minions. So feel free to write down my buzzwords or my helper words to help remember these vocab. There's going to be a lot of vocab. And interneurons are the little guys that help connect the sensory motor input. So imagine like a million minions running around and helping the big minions. That's essentially what the interneurons are. They are helpers of the sensory and motor neurons, okay? All right. So here is our Nancy in all of her fine attire. Doesn't she look beautiful? And we're going to talk about each of what, there's different parts of the neuron that you have to know. So we'll go through each of them. So first, we have our dendrites, and my mnemonic is always to show my hands. Dendrites are the ones that receive messages. So think of the dendrites as stop one on the neuron, okay? So when we're all leading up to the big finale, which I'll talk about. So first, in order for an action to go through, it has to connect to the dendrites, okay? So think of your dendrites as receiving the information. So they attach to different neurons, which will send information. So dendrites are the first stop. I always like to think of them as the fingers, because when we greet people, we shake their hand, maybe not in COVID times right now, but it's it's the receiving of incoming messages, which is our dendrites. And the dendrites kind of look like little phalanges, like little fingers. So that's why I came up with that mnemonic. Okay, so first we have dendrites. And within the dendrites, we have the cell body. It just contains the brain of the neuron. It's where the nucleus is. Other than that, that's all you need to know. Just know that the cell body contains the nucleus, okay? Perfect. And here's the nucleus. It makes decisions to fire or to not fire. So again, the cell body, the soma, is kind of, imagine it like the jelly that contains the nucleus, okay? And the nucleus is like the mini brain of the neuron, okay? And when we talk about, fire or to not fire, we're talking about action potential. So the whole point of a neuron is to send action potential through to the next neuron, right? So sensory motor goes up, motor neuron comes down, and this is happening within a blink of a second, okay? So after we have our nucleus, we now have our axon. So the axon, I kind of imagine the axon as the telephone pole. It's like the telephone pole, and it's the longest part of the neuron which the electric messages travel through. So again, write down this really important part. It's a one-way, okay? So neurons can't go back and forth. The neuron has a one-way. It's a one-way freeway. So sensory neurons only go up to the brain, and motor neurons only go down, okay, from the brain. So again, it's a one-way. So when I say, when I see axon, it's flowing one way, okay? So it's the longest part, and I think of it as like a telephone pole because it's sending a message, okay? And within the axon, we have the most important part of Nancy. This is her coat. This is what protects her. The myelin sheath is a bunch of fatty tissues that insulate the axon, and it helps speed up transmissions, okay? And so some things I want you to write down. What could slow down myelin sheath or degrade it? If we don't treat our brains correctly. So over time, our myelin sheath will start to degrade, and that's why older people have a harder time speaking quicker or doing, and so this is why they tend to slow down. So as your myelin sheath wears down with time, you tend to get slower, right? So that's why your grandparents are getting a little slower to walk. It takes their brain a little bit longer because their neurons are slowing down because their myelin sheath is degrading over time. But also other ways that our myelin sheath could degrade is by abuse of alcohol, abuse of drugs. Our myelin sheath, we only get one, right? And so we have to protect it. We have to protect our brain, okay? So moving on from the myelin sheath, this is a newer vocab term in the newer books, but just so you know, it's just the space between the myelin sheath and the axon it's protecting. It's not the most important vocabulary word. Node of Ranvier, we don't talk about it much, so just kind of know it, but it's not the most important part, okay? Not the most important part of Nancy. And so this is leading us towards our terminals. So the Schwann cells, again, a newer term. They're the non-neural cells in the central nervous system that form myelin sheath. They just don't have it. Other than that, that's really all you have to know. The Schwann cells are just a different type of terminal cells, which, here, let me move my camera. So we have the axon terminal buds. And so these are the last stops. So remember, we came up to the dendrites, we received the message, we now are flowing down through the axon, right? And think of this as a train terminal. So and because the word is axon terminals, you don't need to call them buds, I just call them axon terminals. And it's like a terminal for a train. You gotta get on and leave, it'll send it to the next neuron. So this is the endpoint of the neuron that releases the neurotransmitter, which is the message, into the synapse, okay? So again, Nancy's whole job is to connect the action potential to the next neuron. So we start with our dendrites, right? We go through the axon terminal with the myelin sheath, and then it will flow out of the axon terminals, okay? So when this is action potential, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So it's a neurotransmitter pulse that flows through the neuron. Remember, only one way, okay? And this will lead us to, here's Nancy again. So I just wanted you to see another version of her. This is the older textbook version, so you can see there's the cell body, the dendrites that receive, the axon that flows, that has that the neural impulse flows through, and these are the last of the branches, okay? So again, they enter through the dendrites and they flow through, and the terminal branches of the axon are what's going to send the pulse to the next neuron. But before it gets to the next neuron, we have to talk about one more important part of our neuron, which is the synapses. But the whole point of a neuron is that it's sending action potential, okay? So the action potential is a neural impulse, okay? So it's a neural impulse right here, okay? Neural impulse, and it's a brief electrical charge that travels through the axon. Remember, this is all happening within like super quick. So me, clicking my hands together, it's within milliseconds, right? So the nervous system travels very, very fast, okay? So when Nancy uses the neural system, uses the nervous system, and we'll talk about different ways of how things travel within our body, okay, in later videos. And again, it's a charge that moves down the axon through to the terminal axon branches, and it's a way, we don't need to know too much about the positive and the negatives. This is a little bit more into bio, but action potential is an all-in-one action. You can't stop it midway through. So once you've decided I'm going to pick up my cup, it's already happening as you're moving, right? So think of action potential as an all or nothing response, okay? And that leads us to, we have to hit a threshold. So as the electrical pulse is going through Nancy the neuron, we have to get through the threshold, okay? And a threshold is called, what it means is each neuron receives excitatory and inhibitory signals, which is the plus or the minus. We don't need to know anything more than that, okay? We don't need to get into the chemistry behind it. That's more in a different field. So when your excitatory signals and your inhibitory signals fire, when they create that minimum threshold of you firing the neuron, the action potential goes through. Again, it's an all or nothing response, right? You're either moving or you're not, right? So again, once Nancy is fired, she's going, right? It's an all or nothing response. And the threshold is essentially the buildup needed in order to pass through to make action potential, okay? Again, I know this is a lot to take in, but it's okay. I'm just making sure I'm keeping up with my time. So the synapse. So we have the terminal branches. So imagine, so we have Nancy, and right here, here's Nancy, and she's sending the action potential through the terminal buds, right? The terminal branches, and right at the terminal branch, which is right here, this is at the very end, there's the synaptic gap. So the synapse or the synaptic gap is a junction. So it's a pause. It's a little space between the axon tip of the terminal branches of sending the neuron to the receiving neuron, okay? So it's right before the dendrites hit the axon terminal to connect the neuron to the next neuron. And it's a really huge event that happens here. So the synaptic gap is where the neurotransmitters travel through. So if you see it right here, the neurotransmitters are traveling. Here, let me move my camera. Okay, they're traveling through the synaptic gap to the receiving neuron. And when we learn about medications, that affect our brain, this is where they affect our brain at, right? So right here is where the moneymaker is when we talk about medications in our brain and how they affect our brain. Because sometimes, so say that we need more serotonin in our bodies, what's going to happen is that there's going to be more picked up right through here. So just kind of think of the synaptic gap and kind of keep it in the back of your brain that is where the magic happens when we talk about things going into our brain and where they're affected. The synaptic gaps are where it all is. Okay, so just hang on to that. Hang on to that little tidbit. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So before I talk about reuptake, so again, here's our synapse. I just have another example. So again, this is the end of the axon branches. Here's the beginning of the dendrite. Action potentials going through. We have our neurotransmitters that are flowing through Nancy the neuron, which is our action potential, right? So it's the chemical substance that crosses the synapse to carry the message on to the next neuron. So here's our synapse. Here's our little open space right here. And then the receptor sites are right on this side, right? So it's specific points on the dendrite, right? Because it's the new neuron that's picking it up that receive the specific type of neurotransmitters, okay? And the next step, I always like to call it like if you've ever babysat a kid and they had you wear a food bib. So the bib of Nancy the neuron is reuptake. So after the neurotransmitters have gone through to the next dendrite, to the next neuron, it is reabsorbed into the old neuron. So essentially, there's a few neurotransmitters that are left behind. You see them like they're so when you flow through, there's little remnants of them being left behind. And this process is when they reabsorb. So reuptake is like hanging up the phone. So think of Nancy the neuron as a phone call, and it's sending the call through, and reuptake is the end of the call. So after the neurotransmitter flows through the little space, it closes, and then it reuptakes. It takes up your neurotransmitter, reabsorbs what's left over. Okay, and so when we talk about medications, and this is the perfect example, if you need more serotonin, you know what's going to happen. So instead of absorbing the leftovers, the medication is going to allow it all to flow through. So it gives you more, and I'll explain it a little more in the next few slides when we talk about agonist and antagonist, but the synapses is where the magic happens with the connection of the neurotransmitter and how medications can manipulate the synapses, okay? So again, let's look at how neurotransmitters affect our emotions and emotions. We're pretty much looking at neurotransmitters affect our behavior and our emotions very, very quickly, right? And so we're going to, let me just make sure we have a few more slides. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go over the basic neurotransmitters. So the next slide is going to be different types of neurotransmitters that get sent through your neurons, okay? So let's see what is affected. And I highly recommend you write this down in a beautiful little graph, okay? So types of neurotransmitters that are so, so important. So neurotransmitters travel through the neurons. It's a very fast freeway. Think of so your neurotransmitters travel through your neurons very quickly. So the most popular is, I call it ACH, but it's, so the terms you can even abbreviate ACH, it's acetylcholine. I have a hard time saying the real name, but you can abbreviate it saying ACH. So the ACH neurotransmitter is in control of muscle contractions, memory, and learning. Okay, and so ACH is so if you have lower levels of ACH, you will develop Alzheimer's disease, where you start to forget things, right? Because ACH is what helps our memory and learning. So when people have too low of ACH, they might start to have memory loss. They may not remember what they just learned, right? So very similar to Alzheimer's. So the ACH neurotransmitter is in charge of muscle contractions, memory, and learning, okay? The next one, dopamine. This is our reward sensation. So dopamine is if you get happy when you pet your animals, you're getting dopamine into your brain. So that's why I always like to say when people are petting their animals, I'm like, oh, that's a dopamine hit, right? Because so dopamine, when it's put into our neural pathways, it's connecting it to our reward system. So it's connected with movement, thought process, rewarding sensations. So a lot of people who meditate, a lot of people who they go out in the sun and they feel good. Dopamine is the reward sensation. Okay, it's the reward sensation, so you feel good. So if you ever had like a feel good moment, dopamine has traveled through your body. And so if you have too low of dopamine, you could develop Parkinson's, which is where you lose control of your movement, right? So it's harder to move and to keep still. Schizophrenia is if you have too much dopamine. So schizophrenia is actually one of the biggest mental health disorders that I study. And it's a genetic abnormality because your brain, right when you hit puberty, starts to overdeveloping dopamine, which causes hallucinations and delusions, which are where you start to hear things that aren't there, right? And drug addiction. So some drugs, which we'll talk about in our drug chapter, they overpower. So if we think of, we can even go to, let's think of a random substance. Let's think of cocaine. Okay, let's think of cocaine. Cocaine is connected to our reward system, right? So it makes us feel good. Cocaine, if you keep putting cocaine into your body, your brain is going to start to say, oh, I don't need to produce similar neurotransmitters that make you feel good anymore because I'm getting it. So drug addiction is when your brain stops producing something that's natural because you're replacing it with something artificial. And that's why withdrawals happen. Okay. So again, dopamine, dopamine is what makes you crave things. Okay. So for me, if you get for me, I love Taco Bell. I know how everyone feels. Some people don't like it, but it like fires off my reward system. So it makes me, so if you ever have like cravings of food, that means that when you eat some of your favorite food, you get dopamine hits in your brain. And that's why you start to crave them more, right? But that's on a lower level scale. Okay. And then we have serotonin. And serotonin is it's one of the more, I don't want to say famous ones, but you hear a lot of there's SSRI, so it's serotonin reuptake medication. So essentially what it is serotonin controls our emotional states and sleep. So if you have too low serotonin, it means that if you come in with depression that is prolonged, most likely when they look into your chemical imbalance, it means that you're lacking serotonin and you need more. And so what the medication is going to do, it's going to open up your Nancy the neuron, and it's going to flow more serotonin through your body. Okay. And that is how they help treat depression, right? Especially I'm talking about diagnosed depression. Because remember, it's okay to be depressed every once in a while. It's totally a normal state, right? But I'm talking about prolonged, right? So if people are diagnosed with depression, it's because they need more serotonin, okay? They need more serotonin in their brain, or there's a chemical imbalance, right? So norepinephrine, I always like to say this is like the runner's high. So if anyone loves running, or if you played any sports, norepinephrine is essentially like the body. It's like the way that we. It's like the runner's high. It's like your adrenaline. Okay, it's adrenaline, and so so it's like essentially the neurotransmitter's way of shooting adrenaline through your body. Okay, so it's called norepinephrine, and this causes physical arousal. So that means like you're heightened. So this is your fight or flight response. Okay, so do you notice how it says stress is involved? So this kicks in when you see. So say Sally sees a bear. Norepinephrine is being sent through your body quickly, and it sharpens your learning and your memory at the time. And so norepinephrine is also associated with, if you don't have enough of it, it could cause depression. But also, if you have too much norepinephrine in, so remember when you're stressed for so long and your body's stuck in the stressful state, that is what causes stress. So if you have too much norepinephrine running through your body all the time, it leads to stress, right? So that fight or flight, if you're stuck in fight or flight for too long, right? We then have GABA. So GABA is another neurotransmitter, and this is it's inhibition of brain activity. So essentially it's in control of how quickly your neurons are firing off, right? So people who have too much GABA could have some anxiety disorders. So, and when we think of anxiety, it's, people like to say, your thoughts never stop, your brain's always going. So GABA essentially keeps your brain activity at a full level where you can connect, dots, you can do multiple things at once. But if you have too much GABA, your brain, so a lot of people, when they say they have anxiety, it's like their brain never stops. They're always thinking something else. This is where it comes from. There's a little bit too much GABA, and that's where that could form. And then we have endorphins. So this is, sorry, I said norepinephrine was the runner's high. I'm sorry, endorphins is the runner's high. I apologize. I still get a few of these mixed up every once in a while, so make sure you create really good mnemonics. So norepinephrine is adrenaline, and endorphins is the runner's high, okay? So the pain perception, positive emotions, runner's high, this is where It's that happy feeling. It's like when you ace a test or when you finish a race and you're just like on that like, I can conquer the world, right? You're so full of positive emotions. That is endorphins, right? And people who do what they love, they go do hobbies, they go hiking, it brings endorphins into their body, which makes them feel good, right? And so endorphins flood your brain when you're doing things that you love. Okay. And endorphins also, if you are in fight or flight and you feel, and so if you've ever been playing like a sports game and you get hit with a soccer ball to the face and you don't really feel it at the time, endorphins can also block pain for a slight. So if you've ever like been in a sports game and you're like, oh, that didn't feel too bad. And afterwards, when your runner's high is over and your body calms down, you're like, wow, I really hurt. It's because endorphins can block pain for a certain amount of time, which is, isn't that just crazy, right? Our brain is so interesting with all these neurotransmitters. But again, so if people get, so endorphins, the way that you feel with endorphins is similar to people who, if you take an opiate, which we'll go into our drug chapter semi-soon, it becomes very addicting. So that runner's high that you feel, you can get through, that's how opiates make you feel. And that is why opiates is one of the most hardest drugs that you could try to withdraw from because it is so highly addictive. So opiates are the most addictive, but it's because it gives you this runner's high that everyone craves, right? So these are just some associated disorders with either too much of it or too little. So when we think of our biological lens, hopefully the chemical imbalance is starting to make sense as we look at, certain situations. And last but not least, we have one more vocab to do before we end this video lecture for this section. And so neurotransmitters, they bind with the next neurotransmitter, right? So as Nancy, the neuron flows through and the terminal axons here, they attach, so the next dendrites right here, there's two type of receptors that you will run into. And this is really, really cool how this works, okay? So it's called agonists and antagonists, okay? So let me get out, there you go. So agonists, they mimic neurotransmitter activity, okay? So think of agonists as, here, let me put my screen again. Agonists let more of the neurotransmitters go. So if Sally's feeling, depressed and she needs to have more serotonin in her body, the medication that is given, if it's prescribed, it allows your neurotransmitters to open and it sends more through. It stops the reuptake process. So it lets more of the serotonin through. But on the opposite end, antagonists, they block. So remember in schizophrenia, if you have too much dopamine, antipsychotics block. They are antagonists and they block dopamine from going through their brain because they already have too much. So it blocks it, okay? So when we think of agonists and antagonists, agonists send more neurotransmitters through and antagonists stop them, okay? And we'll go more over it as, we'll go over it more as time goes on. And so just something to remember before I let you guys end this first video is that, again, agonists open, and antagonists stop, okay? They stop the neurotransmitters from going in. All right, feel free to take a quick stretch break before you start your next video notes.